Okay, I am ready to move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called The Summer Before the War. Now, certainly there had been trouble coming. Anyone who has had any experience with wars would have seen it long before the afternoon that Mac ran down Morris the florist. There had been general grumbling. New York had become so crowded with cars and taxis and buses and trucks that the traffic was very slow. Now, at first, everyone blamed everyone else. People who drove their own cars grumbled about people who rode in taxis. If there were no taxis, said the automobile owners, there would be room to drive in the streets. The taxi drivers, on the other hand, complained about people who drove their own cars. If private cars were kept off the streets, they'd say, people could get where they wanted in a hurry, as the taxi drivers claimed. Now, the bus drivers suggested that both the taxis and the private cars should all get off the streets, and the people who liked to walk found fault with everybody on wheels. But what they all could agree on is that everyone was irritated with trucks. There were so many of them, and they were so big that they did not have to get out of the way for anyone. Most of the businesses in the cities hired the trucks to carry their goods from one place to another. To get an idea of how many trucks there were in the streets at the time, one may turn to the telephone book of that very year. Now, in the classified section, for instance, if one opens up just to the P listings, here are a few of the products you will find advertised there. Package handlers, paint, pajama trimmings, pancake mixes, pants, paper plates, parachutes, park benches, parking meters, parquet floors, party favors, paste, patent medicines, patterns, paving bricks, pawn tickets, peas, peanut butter, pearls, pecans, pencils, pen knives, penicillins, pennants, pens, peppers, perambulators, percolators, perfumes, periodicals, permanent wave machines, pets shop supplies, petroleum, pewter, pharmaceuticals, phonographs, photo supplies, piano stools, picadillos, pickle barrels, picnic tables, picture frames, picture postcards, picture windows, pies, pigskins, pile drivers, pillows, pins, pipes, pipe organs, pistol belts, piston rings, pizza pie supplies, place cards, planetariums, plant foods, plaques, plaster of Paris, plastics, plate glass, platforms, platinum, playground equipment, playing cards, play suits, playthings, pleating machine parts, plexiglass pliers, plows, plugs, plumbago, plushes, plywoods, pocketbooks, podiums, poker chips, poisons, poles, police badges, Polish polo mallets, pom-poms, ponchos, pony carts, pool tables, popcorn machines, porch furniture, postage stamp affixers, posters, potatoes, potato peelers, pot holders, potted plants, pottery, poultry, powder puffs, precious stones, precision castings, premium goods, preserves, pressing machines, pressure cookers, pretzels, price tags, printing presses, propellers, projectors, prunes, public address systems, publications, pulleys, pulpits, pumice, pumps, punch bowls, puppets, purses, pushcart parts, putties, and puzzles. Just to give you an idea of how many goods needed to be transported across the city. Now, one must keep in mind that the products mentioned above are only a few of the things and just the things listed under P. Consider, too, that the phone book lists not only pile drivers, for example, but 43 different companies in the pile driving business, not to mention the 7,234 different companies in the plastics business. And then if one remembers that each of these 43 companies employ on average 17 and a half trucks every day, one can finally start to begin to get the idea of the number of trucks there must have been in New York just before this Pushcart War. And the worst of it was that during the period that more and more trucks had been appearing on the city streets, these trucks had been getting bigger and bigger and wider and wider. The truck drivers had it all figured out. At least that is what Professor Lynn Cumberly of New York University said when he was writing about the Pushcart War many years later. Sorry, after all those peas, I needed a good yawn. Professor Cumberly's notion was that the truck drivers had gotten together and had figured out that with all the crowded traffic conditions, the only way for them to get where they needed to go was to be so big that you didn't have to get out of the way of anybody. And this is what he became known as the large object theory of history. Chapter 5. Wenda Gambling sees all the danger signs. Now, it is a matter of historical record that the average truck in New York City at the time of the Pushcart War became so big that no one driving behind it could see around to check the names of the streets that they were about to pass. Wenda Gambling, a well-known movie star, was on her way to 96th Street to visit her 90-year-old grandmother, and once got stuck behind a giant gasoline truck. Now, even for all her experience in the movies, Wenda was a timid driver and was afraid that the truck would explode if she tried to pass it. It had a giant red danger signs painted all over it, as Wenda recalled. Since Wenda didn't dare pass the truck, and since it was too big for her to see any of the street signs, she not only went past 96th Street, where she was supposed to turn, but was at Bear Mountain, some 50 miles past the city limits, before she had any idea where she was. By then, of course, she was so frightened that she had to spend the night in a log cabin way up in Harriman State Park. A search party didn't find her until 6:30 the next morning. She had not had anything to eat but some dry oatmeal that somebody had left in the cabin. And this kind of thing kept happening. Wenda's case is remembered because Wenda was famous, and her activities were always reported in the headlines. But many other people ran into similar troubles. Picture. Hey, Beans. Come on. Now, more and more, the truck drivers crowded other drivers to the sides of the streets. No, don't eat the cord, please. You can sit there, though. Now, more and more, the truck drivers crowded other drivers to the sides of the street. They hogged all the best parking places, or if there were no parking places, and a truck driver felt like having a cup of coffee, he would simply stop his truck right in the middle of the street and just leave it there, blocking all the traffic for miles behind him. And the heavier the traffic, the ruder the truck drivers became. At busy intersections, they never let anyone else go first. And if anyone tried to, a truck driver only had to rev his engine and keep on coming, and they had to get out of the way. Few automobile drivers cared to even bother argue with a 12-ton truck, even when they were the ones who were right. And even the taxi drivers began to lose their confidence. For a long time, the taxis had been considered a match for the trucks because of the daring and speed and skill of the drivers. But when even taxi drivers grew cautious, more and more people became alarmed. Chapter 6. The Peanut Butter Speech. Now, one of the first people to speak out against this growing danger was a man named Archie Love. Now, Archie Love was running for mayor at the time, and he promised to reduce the number of trucks on the street. It looked for a little while as if Archie Love might get elected on the strength of this promise alone. But that was before Archie's opponent, Emmett P. Cudd, who was already mayor and did not want to lose his job, he made his famous peanut butter speech right in Union Square. Now, Mayor Cudd repeated the peanut butter speech 90 times in that first week alone, and it more or less went like this. I don't think the mayor yawned before he gave the speech, but maybe he did. Excuse me. Friends and New Yorkers, New York is one of the biggest cities in the USA, and we are proud of that fact. And what makes a city big? Big businesses, naturally. And what is the difference between big businesses and small businesses? It is this. If you order 14 cartons of peanut butter, you are running a small business. If you order 400 cartons of peanut butter, then you are running a big business. 14 cartons of peanut butter you can get delivered in a station wagon. But for 400 cartons of peanut butter, you need a truck. And you need a big truck. And big trucks mean progress. Now, my opponent, Archie Love, is against trucks. He is therefore against progress. And who knows, perhaps he is even against peanut butter. Now, naturally, all of the truck drivers voted to re-elect Mayor Cudd, and so did a lot of other people. Very few people wanted to be seen as being against progress, and no one wanted to be seen as being against peanut butter. And everyone really wanted to be proud of their city, because they always had been. And thus, poor Archie Love did not get elected. And thus, the trucks kept getting bigger and bigger. And as the trucks increased in size, traffic, as Archie Love had predicted, grew steadily worse and worse and worse, until in the spring, just before the Pushcart War, the city was like one giant traffic jam all day. One day, it took a taxi 4 hours to drive down 5 blocks. Now, the passenger in that taxi was Professor Lyman Cumberly, who did not complain because he was working on his large object theory of history and found the situation of being stuck in traffic rather interesting from a scientific point of view. During his ride, Professor Cumberly fell into conversation with an impatient young man from Seattle who was trapped in an adjoining taxi. Now, the young man was shocked that so many new... Sorry, James is getting restless. Hey, you... You can't lay on my lap if you're going to be eating cords. Now, during this ride, the Professor Cumberly fell into conversation with an impatient young man from Seattle who was trapped in a taxi next to him. The young man was shocked that so many New Yorkers accepted the terrible conditions of their streets and weren't protesting. And Professor Cumberly recalls that the visitor had very definite ideas about what he thought should be done about these trucks. In fact, encouraged by Professor Cumberly's interest, the young man flew back to Seattle and wrote a book. This book is called The Enemy in the Streets, and it was a fearless attack on the trucks. However, as the author is unknown, the book didn't receive much notice at the time that it was originally published. And it is only remembered today largely because the president, and it is only remembered today largely because the author is now the President of the United States. Chapter 7. The words that triggered the war. Wenda Gambling's innocent remark. She was the one who couldn't see around the trucks and ended up getting lost. He was a movie star. What do you think? Maybe just one more chapter or two more chapters. Now, what finally brought all of this to a head was a television program called The Day the Traffic Stopped. The day before the program, the traffic had stopped entirely. And one of the television stations had hurriedly called a panel of experts to come on and explain what happened. The members of the panel were one Robert Alexander Wrightson, who was the traffic commissioner of New York, Alexander P. Wolfson, who was the head of Wolfson & Wolfson, a company specializing in traffic coordination, one Dr. Wolf Alexander, a traffic psychologist, and Wenda Gambling, a well-known movie star. Now, Wenda was hardly any kind of expert on traffic, but as the other three panel members were all elderly men, one short and stocky, one bald, and one nearsighted, the moderator of the program felt that the panel would be more interesting to viewers if Wenda were at the table. In introducing Wenda, the moderator of the program said, quote, "As we all know, Miss Gambling's new movie, The Streets of New York, is being shot on the streets of New York. And as the streets of New York are the subject of our discussion here today, it is very appropriate that she should be here." Now, Wenda tactfully left most of the talking to the experts. Each of the three men all had a different theory as to why the traffic had stopped. Robert had said that there was no cause for alarm and the whole thing was a simple matter of what he liked to call the destiny of moving objects. Alexander disagreed. He said the problem involved nothing more than a predictable increase in the number of unmoving objects. And Dr. Wolf said that it did not matter whether the objects were moving or unmoving, as the whole thing could easily be solved by a more thorough coordinating of drivers into hopeless situations. "And what do you think, Miss Gambling?" said the moderator as the three experts began to argue among one another. "Well, I don't know what they're talking about," said Wenda Gambling. "Well," said the moderator, who was not quite sure himself what they were talking about, "I believe our subject this evening is traffic." "Oh," said Wenda Gambling. "Well, I think that there are too many trucks and that the trucks are too big." Now, since most of the television audience had been watching Wenda Gambling rather than the experts, and since everyone watching did know what Wenda was talking about, even if they couldn't understand what all of the experts and professors were talking about, this one seemingly simple remark received more attention than anything else that was said on the whole program. Before the program was off the air, over 5,000 viewers had called into the station to say they agreed with Wenda. You can see the trucks just keep getting bigger and bigger. And more of them. Now, Professor Lyman Cumberly had suggested that, except for Wenda Gambling's innocent remark, there might never have even been a Pushcart War. Instead, says Professor Cumberly, the trucks would have simply gone on to completely take over the city, crowding out all of the taxis, the buses, the cars, and finally all of the people themselves. No one would have challenged them until it was too late. It would, Professor Cumberly believes, have been the end of life in New York as we know it. But once Wenda Gambling had stated the danger for all to hear in simple and understandable language, war was inevitable. Okay. One more chapter. Chapter 8. The Secret Meeting and the Declaration of War. And these are excerpts from the diary of one Joey Cathles. Now, the truck drivers themselves were the first to grasp the meaning of the widespread response to Wenda Gambling's remarks. The day after that television program, representatives of all of the big trucking companies in the city got together and held a secret meeting. The meeting was organized by the Three, as the owners of the three largest trucking companies were called. Now, the Three were 1. Mo Mammoth of Mammoth Moving Company, or sometimes Big Mo, as his drivers called him. Another was Walter Sweet of Tiger Trucking, who preferred to be known as the Tiger. And Louis Livergreen of LEMA, Lower East Side Moving Association. Now, the Three were originally known as the Big Three, but this caused some confusion as the leaders of three important nations at the time were also called the Big Three, and after a city newspaper had run a headline announcing Big Three Carve Up China, which was a story about Mammoth, Lima, and Tiger Trucking buying out a China cart and storage company, there was some international trouble, of course, in the course of which Moscow had bombed an Indo-Chinese pilot. And after all this confusion, the city newspapers decided it was probably best that the firms were simply known as the Three to avoid confusion. The plotting of the Pushcart War and the truckers' strategy was for the most part the work of the Three. Now, Big Mo generally served as spokesperson of them, and it was Big Mo who presided over this secret meeting. Look at those shysters, the owning class. The meeting was held in an underground garage owned by Mammoth Moving. It was at this meeting that a young truck driver named Joey Cathles had the nerve to stand up and say, "The people are right, traffic is lousy, and there are too many trucks." Uh-oh. Now, Joey, who worked for Tiger Trucking, was fired immediately after the meeting. But fortunately for us, Joey had kept a diary. The diary was something that he had started to pass time with when his truck was stalled or in a traffic jam. And it was from this diary that we have the first-hand account of what happened at that first secret meeting and the days that followed. Here are some excerpts from Joey Cathles' diary, dated the day after the secret meeting. February 15th, 9th Avenue and 66th Street, en route to 9th and 86th, with 24 pipe organs, 11:15 a.m. He writes, "It looks like a long tie up ahead, so I may as well put down a few more facts about the meeting from last night." Now, after I've said traffic is lousy, there was a big silence. Everybody looked over at me, very surprised, and several guys looked as if I had hurt their feelings. And then Big Mo, who was running the meeting, he gets up and he growls, And by that, I mean he cleared his throat in a particular way that someone like Big Mo has of clearing his throat. It's as if you were racing your engine a little bit just to test whether you have the power and the engine is warmed up. Now maybe traffic is not so good, Big Mo says. And for a minute, I think maybe he's gonna agree with me, but instead he glares at me and says, and he is nicely warmed up by now, "I say, Mr. Calfless, that is all a question of who is to blame for the traffic. Why are you picking on the poor trucks?" And when Big Mo says poor trucks, I laughed out loud. But nobody hears me because everyone else is cheering at the top of their lungs for Big Mo. 12:15 p.m., 9th Avenue and 69th Street. So I thought I was going to make 86th by lunchtime, but there's still trouble ahead and traffic, so I'll continue. Now, after Big Mo says poor trucks, a trucker named Little Milty stands up, and Little Milty says, "I agree with Big Mo. Why blame the poor trucks? If you ask me, the problem is all those push carts that are blocking the streets." Now, nobody likes Little Milty very much, as he's known as a very mean person and a mean driver. And by that, I mean Little Milty would crowd out another truck just as easily as he would run over a taxi. But for once, Little Milty gets a huge round of applause, and about 10 different truck drivers then begin to tell about how slow the pushcarts are and how the pushcarts are always sitting by the curb, right where a trucker wants to park, and how the pushcarts should not even be allowed to take up space in a modern city like New York. Well, once more I have to laugh, and this time everybody hears me laugh. And so I explain. I say, come on, how much room do a couple of push carts take? Because personally, I don't mind the push carts. When I'm stuck in traffic like today, and like most any day for that matter, a push cart will come along and will sell me a sausage roll, which passes the time and keeps me from going hungry. You get the best sausage rolls all around over on Thompson Street and 69th, where I am now. It's not too good. Oh, you get the best sausage rolls around over on Thompson Street, but on 69th, where I am now, it's not too good for sausage rolls. Looks like something's moving up ahead, so I'll put this notebook away for another time. 9th Avenue and 75th Street, 4:05 p.m. Well, now there's a trailer truck backed up to the curb on 76. It's sticking halfway across the street. The taxi drivers ahead says that they're unloading permanent wave machines and that it's going to take at least a half hour. So I may as well finish writing about the secret meeting while it's still fresh in my mind. I left off with how I was speaking up for the pushcarts. Come on, I had said. How much room do a few pushcarts take? And I addressed my question to a driver named Mac. You could line up 24 pushcarts along the curb before those carts would take up even 1/2 the space of one truck, especially one like a Mighty Mammoth, and I point out Mac, because Mac drives a Mighty Mammoth. Or I say a 10-ton Tiger, I say, putting myself in that same spot. And when I mention a 10-ton Tiger, Big Mo looks at my boss. My boss is Mr. Walter Sweet, who's sitting right beside Big Mo, as he is one of the three. And Big Mo asks Walter Sweet, "Does this boy drive for you at Tiger Trucking?" Which is a silly question, as I have as much as I said, I drive a 10-ton Tiger, and the boss has to admit I do. I'm sorry if I embarrass the boss. Mr. Walter Sweet has a kind heart for the most part. Do you have anything more to say, Mr. Calfless? Big Mo asks me, and he asks me in such a tone of voice that I know he is telling me that he could be helpful in helping me to lose my job. However, I'm not afraid of Big Mo. It occurred to me a long time ago that there are so many reasons you could lose a job that if you start to worry about all of them, you'd be afraid to say anything. And for anyone who has a lot to say, as I do, this would be a much greater hardship. However, I shut up for the simple reason that I do not have anything else to say at the moment. It's such a nutty argument, the whole deal with the pushcarts. This is him getting one of those tasty sausages. And why he says, these pushcart guys, I like them. Now, the next speaker at the secret meeting is one Louis Livergreen. Louis owns all those leaping llamas over on Lower East Side and has pretty well cut everybody else out of business down there. Now, Louis speaks in a real smooth way. He is not a pleasant-looking man, but he speaks with a smooth voice. I've noticed that each of the three speaks in a different way. See, Big Mo speaks with a loud, booming voice. A voice like a truck driver, my sister once said, which I felt was kind of an insulting remark, but many people do think of truck drivers that way. A tiger, on the other hand, he has a low voice, and Louis Livergreen, he speaks, as I mentioned, with more of a smooth talking voice. Now, of the three, it's Louis Livergreen that I would be afraid of most. And I think that's because his voice is as smooth as a good grade of oil. Whether what he has to say is something perfectly pleasant or horribly terrible, it's hard to tell. If somebody says something terrible in a pleasant tone of voice, it makes me very nervous. Almost where I'd feel better if they were yelling. Well, as I said, Louis Livergreen starts to talk about the drivers in that smooth voice of his. He says, our boys are telling us that the pushcart drivers are ruining the city. And believe me, I am glad that you've been so frank about the trouble. Mr. Mammoth and Mr. Sweet, myself, well, we're not out in the trucks so much for ourselves. We have to rely on our boys just to give us the facts. Now that we've got the facts, it's very clear what we've got to do. And Louis explains that what we've got to do is just educate the public. When people complain about the traffic, he says, we have to tell the people who's to blame. Otherwise, they're going to end up blaming the poor truckers. It's all about education. From the tone of his voice and the respectful way the truck drivers are listening to him, Louis could be delivering a sermon in front of church, which is not exactly the case. Now, I know what you boys are up against, Louis goes on to say. I operate on the east side, where most of the pushcarts also operate. And I know these people. They are behind the times, and to be honest, they're a danger to the rest of us. I really hate to say it, but they've got to go. Louis gets a big round of applause at this point, but he's still not finished. And I'll tell you something else, he says. And this isn't something I'm proud to say, but my own father was a pushcart peddler. And if I had not had the guts to get out and fight for myself and get a better life, no matter who was in the way, well, heck, I might be pushing a pushcart myself. Instead, Louis points out, I have built up the firm of Lima with my own two hands and put 100 leaping llamas on the street every day of the year, rain or shine, and I'm proud of that. And Louis gets another big round of applause, but not from me. While I agree that 100 trucks is impressive, I do not see why a man who wants to talk as Louis is talking about his own father, who maybe his father struggled and didn't have such an easy time, and rain or shine was out on the streets with a pushcart, whereas Louis, if it rains, he sits inside and sends out 100 drivers. But Louis had a few other remarks, mainly this one. He said, I think you boys know that Lower East Side Moving Association has been working on a master plan for the streets of New York, a plan that will greatly improve the situation for us truck drivers and for everyone. I've discussed this plan with Mr. Mo Mammoth and Mr. Walter Sweet, and the plan is moving forward nicely. But before it can go into effect, we have got to solve this pushcart problem once and for all. Now, I have not heard about this master plan, this final solution of Louis Livergreen's, but all around me, drivers are nodding as if it is a fine idea. I asked several of the boys about it, and they say it's probably the usual thing to make things better for progress, to make things better for the truckers in the street, and maybe more money for us drivers. I don't know about this master plan, but it seems to me that the idea of the meeting is that the three are declaring their war on the pushcarts. Well, I got to get going for now. The taxi driver ahead of me is signaling that they got those permanent wave machines off the trailer. Unfortunately, I see it's 5:30, so I'll have to take the pipe organs back to the warehouse and try to get to 86th Street tomorrow. Really, this traffic is lousy. Note: Joni Kaflis never did get to deliver the pipe organs that he was transporting on February 15th because the following day he was fired, and the rest of his diary ends up concerned with a potato farm in eastern Long Island that he acquired shortly thereafter. Okay, that's it for now.